I'm Todd Jones, recovering from 30 years as a sports writer. Thanks for joining me as I sit down with some of the best sports writers of our time who knew the greatest athletes and coaches and experienced firsthand some of the biggest sports moments of the past half-century. We'll share stories behind the stories, some we've only told each other. Pull up a seat on Press Box Access. Kevin Blackistone might be the only sports writer I know who has written about Byron Nelson and Nelson Mandela. Kevin switched from being a news reporter to covering sports in 1990, and his columns in the Washington Post, and before that, the Dallas Morning News, have always made me think. Read Kevin, and you pause and ponder. He's also been entertaining sports fans while informing them as a longtime participant on the ESPN show Around the Horn. We're lucky to have him as a guest. Kevin, thanks for joining us on the show. It's a real honor, and it's great to catch up with you again.
Well, thanks for the invite, Todd. Appreciate it.
We cross paths a lot in major sporting events, but there was a day at the Athens Olympics in 2004 when you and I went to lunch.
That's right.
And we were eating Greek food, and I think both of our heads were going to explode out of delight.
That's right. The Athens Games, that little Greek diner just down the street from that dormitory that we were staying in.
Yeah. I mean, our eyes were like cartoon bug-eyed. You know, we were like, oh, my God, this food. Lord, I've died and gone to heaven.
Yeah, those were good times.
So no slight, but, you know, when I think of you, not only do I think of great journalism, I think of great tomatoes. So you've done this for 40 years and just covered everything and written so many great pieces. When somebody says something to you like, hey, what have you done the last 40 years? How do you sum up a career like that?
Well, I've done sports since 1990. Prior to doing sports, I covered economics for about 4 or 5 years. And before that, I did news, most of which was investigative journalism, actually data journalism, into social justice affairs, which we didn't call social justice journalism at the time, and we didn't call data journalism at the time. We just called it reporting. So for the last 30 years doing sports has been, it's been a lot of fun. It's taken me around the country. It's also taken me around the world. Covered the Olympics in Athens, covered the Olympics in Sydney, covered the Olympics in Barcelona, covered the Olympics in Vancouver. It's been great, and seen a lot of incredible stories unfold before your eyes. Talked to a lot of really interesting people. So it's been a blast, and also seen a transformation of the sports media industry, not only in the way that it does business, but also in the types of stories that it is interested in. And ESPN has an entire site, The Undefeated, dedicated towards covering race and culture and social justice issues within sports. So,
well, I think you're a real pioneer in this. I mean, you broke down walls in the world of sports journalism. You know, you and Bill Rhoden and Michael Wilbon and Terrence Moore in Atlanta. You know, some of these guys that really paved the way for that. And I think that's why I have so much respect for your career. The thing that makes me really laugh about sports sometimes is that we think of it as the toy department, and some of these really absurd things exist, but they exist in the culture. But I wanted to ask you about some of the absurd things too.
Right.
And there was a night, but it's funny, but there was so you're so smart, and you teach. You're a professor of journalism at the University of Maryland. I mean, you have a vita, right? A curriculum vita. I don't even know.
That's right.
I don't even know most sports writers know what a vita is.
I also have
a
match
cheese
vita.
Or, hey, bartender, give me 2 Vitas.
I was going to say, I also have a Matt Vita, who's the editor of the Post.
That's right. You bring this wisdom and this smarts, but then there's a night like June 28th, 1997, and you're sitting ringside at the MGM Grand for a heavyweight championship fight between Mike Tyson and Evander Holyfield. Tell me about that.
Oh man, that was a crazy night. So everybody knows what happened, right? That's the That's the fight where Tyson bites off a piece of Evander Holyfield's ear. And that it sounds crazy even to repeat it. But yeah, I remember, there was nothing more exciting in sports that I ever covered than a Mike Tyson fight. I mean, it was just electric. It was just the energy and the crowd and the anticipation. And Mike Tyson fights were off the charts. And so, yeah, this was a huge fight. And most people did not think Evander Holyfield could beat Tyson. If I'm not mistaken, we got there at the beginning of that week, and I think the odds were 22-1. And I remember Ron Borges bought a ticket at 18-1. So at any rate,
from the Boston Globe.
That's right, from the Boston Globe. So he was very, very happy at the end of this fight. But so we're sitting there, and and the fight has started, and they're going on, and then all of a sudden there's this stoppage. And we weren't really sure what the stoppage was for, and there was a little lull. And then you heard someone in the press area or right up on ringside say something like, he bit his ear off. And everybody looked at each other and were like, and it's very tight quarters when you're ringside. It's like, what did he say? There's no way that happened. And so they have a big screen in the MGM Grand Arena. And eventually they played the replay, and we looked up and we're like, oh no, he did bite his ear off. So then you are certain.
Wait a minute. What was your reaction? Did you see that? What was your reaction?
Yeah, you looked up and he didn't take the whole ear off, but you could see that he definitely gnawed into his ear, and that he had taken out a little chunk of the ear, and Holyfield was grabbing his ear, and there was blood, and it was surreal. But here's the thing: you just knew at that point that the fight was over. And Mills Lane, the famous Mills Lane, was in the ring, and you just knew the fight was over.
Look at the fight. He bit his ear. He's out.
And the amazing thing was, it wasn't. They said, let's see it. They got the corner.
Hey, he's got another ear.
That's right.
He's got two ears.
You're exactly right. So they start the fight over, and not only does he have another ear, but Tyson goes after him again and bites the other side of his face. And at that point, all hell broke loose, and they stopped the fight. So one thing you'll remember, which is nobody does anymore, but back in the day for a very late sporting event, you write a pre-piece to kind of hold the space in the paper so you can just plug in your story right on deadline.
Yeah.
And so I had a pre-column that was written, and it was holding the space in Sunday's paper. So I'm rewriting, and I'm just writing crazy, and you're right on deadline, and it's just all sorts of commotion. And I get up and I go to the press room that's underneath the arena, and go in there and finish up, and I go to file, and I can't get a connection. Try again,
that's
again.
Like the worst.
Oh my God, I can't get a connection. I'm looking at my watch. It's coming right up on, whatever the time was, midnight or whatever. So I'm like, this is crazy. I'm going to have to go to my hotel room. So I pack up and I run out of the press room. I go up the escalator, and there is just a sea of humanity. And one thing about a Mike Tyson fight is there are dudes at the Mike Tyson fight who you do not want to accidentally bump into, whose shoe you don't want to accidentally step on. And so I'm trying to maneuver through this crowd, and it's just, I just can't explain. I mean, it's complete pandemonium. And I get up to my room, I plug my computer in, I hit send, it goes through, I call my desk, I say, did you get it? They say, yeah, we got it, but it's too late.
Oh, no.
So I go downstairs to get a drink. Well.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
You got to, right. So I go downstairs, and it's just a ton of people, and I go to a bar, and all of a sudden, you hear people screaming and you see people running. Going, what the hell's going on? So all of a sudden the gendarmes come through and they're clearing out the casino area. They're clearing out the places where people are standing. If you don't have a card for staying there, they're ushering you out the door. It was crazy, which you've never seen. Casinos never send people out.
They don't want you to leave, right? Yeah, right. No.
So come to find out, days later, or maybe the next day, there were several sounds within the casino that sounded like gunshots, and that sent people scurrying, and that sent the security in. The MGM claimed that it wasn't shots, that some tables fell over.
Yeah,
who knows?
That's what it sounds like, when a table falls over.
Right. Who knows? All I know is that Dave Anderson and Mike Wilbon, they dove under a table at a restaurant they were at. I think they were at P.F. Chang's or something like that. And it was just crazy.
Life of a sports writer.
Life of a sports writer.
That's great. That's crazy. I brought that night up because in sports writing, you have absurd moments happen. And again, you're bringing in, a perspective from outside of sports, and yet you have to like put that type of moment into context. And I think that's what you always brought to sports journalism, and still do. I mean, you're on ESPN Around the Horn. You're writing for the Washington Post. You're still bringing this perspective, and yet you still have these nights that just are crazy, and like what in the hell is going on here? So with that in mind, and you didn't want to be a sports writer, what the hell happened? How did you become a sports writer?
That's crazy too. I was covering economics. As I mentioned, for the Dallas Morning News. I had been at the paper about 5 years, 5 or 6 years. And I had a couple of offers to go cover economics elsewhere, two of which were in my hometown of D.C. One was with the Washington Post, and one was with USA Today. And I was mulling them over, and then the sports editor came to me, and he said, and I had done a little bit of work for the sports department, and he said, we want to start a beat. We want to start a business of sports beat. And would you be, we'd like you to do it. We're offering you that job. And I thought about it a while. I was like, I just thought at the time it was too narrow. I just didn't, I wanted to do more than that. Well, just at that time, there was a columnist at the Dallas Morning News. He left to go to Arizona. So that opened up a columnist spot. So Dave Smith, the innovative sports editor for the Morning News, came up with an idea. He wasn't just going to hire one columnist to replace David Cat Stevens. He was going to hire 3, and he was going to do that by using diverse voices that really were very rare in sports journalism at the time, and certainly in Dallas and in Texas.
Yeah, it's 1990, right?
1990.
89, 90, 91, yeah.
So he promoted he promoted Kevin Sherrington to columnist, a young white writer. He promoted Kathy Harasta to a columnist, one of the few women. Yeah. And then he recruited me. I had to think hard about it, because now, I like sports. I knew it was not going to be easy going into a job that people covet and doing something I've never, ever done on a regular basis.
Yeah, that said, but journalism was always kind of part of your life, right? Even growing up, didn't you deliver the Washington Post as a kid?
Delivered the Washington Post, the Washington Star, and the Washington Daily News, which only lasted about a year. Delivered them all.
Wow.
Yeah.
How many times did you change the tires on your bike?
That's right. A lot of arm throwing. Oh, I had a great system. I had a grocery cart, and I probably delivered about 100 newspapers every morning.
You never thought you were going to be ringside when a guy bites a guy's ear?
No. What I did think I might be is I might be at the hearing for reinstating the license of the guy who bit off the guy's ear, which is another crazy story. Flying back out to Las Vegas for the Mike Tyson's hearing. Oh, it was. Yeah, let's hear it. No pun intended. But yeah, so after the Tyson thing, he is stripped of his or his license is suspended, so he has to go before the Athletic Commission in Las Vegas, the Nevada Athletic Commission, to plead for his license back, and so it's a big news event. Go out there for that. And so we're in this courtroom-like setting for most of the day, and Tyson's sitting there, and his representatives are speaking on his behalf. He speaks. I remember his wife at the time was there.
At the time.
Yeah, at the time. Richard.
Key words in that sentence.
That's right. At any rate, they go through this whole thing, and then the hearing is over, and then Mike and his entourage, they go out a back door, and so we all scramble out the front door to because we're trying to get to Mike. We want to get a quote from Mike.
Right.
And we find him coming out the back and underneath this building, and there was a Ducati motorcycle parked right there. And Mike comes out, and he's got a helmet on, and he gets on the Ducati, and he cranks it, rev it up. And we're yelling questions at Mike. Boom. The bike stalls. It won't start. And then Mike gets off the bike, and as soon as he does, like some car pulls up, some dark colored car with tinted windows. The door opens up. Mike gets off his bike. He takes his helmet in frustration, and he slams it to the ground. And it hit the ground and it bounces up. And I don't know that has come back into orbit since. And Mike gets in the car, slams the door, and the car speeds off. And that was it. So that was part two of that crazy story.
Well, you think about this. I mean, you spent a decade, covering news, investigations, economics. You're with the Chicago Reporter magazine. You're doing all this news stuff for the Dallas Morning News. And literally at the time that you decided to make the switch to sports, you had just covered the Nelson Mandela U.S. tour, right? Like he had just been released from prison, and it was in the U.S., and you're covering this.
Oh, that was another one. And you can appreciate this because it was almost like covering, a basketball team on the road when they're doing back-to-backs. Because he was he was over here for about a week, and every day he was in another city. So I split the coverage with one of my best friends, Kevin Merida, who is now the head of the Undefeated. He covered the first leg, I think, and I covered the second leg. So I was in Detroit, Oakland, Atlanta. You're so worn out because you fly into a city, you throw your bags down in whatever hotel is closest to the airport. You go cover him wherever he's at. You write your story. Then you go back to your hotel and grab something to eat and get on a plane first thing in the morning and go to another city. And Detroit, Oakland, it was crazy. And but it was a lot of fun. It was an incredible thing to see. And, the challenge was, how can I write something that no one else is writing about the same thing? Because you're just seeing him giving these speeches.
Right.
And seeing him.
Yeah, did you ever have much interaction with Mandela?
No, you couldn't get close to him. But
right.
I came up with a few ideas along the way. My best idea was I was with him when he got to Atlanta, and so he was speaking at Bobby Dodd Stadium, Georgia Tech's football stadium. So I was like, well, if I go over there, I'm just going to hear the speech. So I remembered that H. Rap Brown, who at the time had turned his name and he'd become Muslim, lived in Atlanta. He had a grocery store in Atlanta. I knew that. And H. Rap Brown was, he was one of the infamous Black Power leaders of the 60s, early 70s. I think he was the one that came up with the phrase, what does it say? Violence is as American as cherry pie, something like that. So at any rate, I knew somebody who knew him. So I called my friend. I said, hey, I'm going to be in Atlanta for Nelson Mandela. Do you think A-Trap Brown would talk to me about what he sees in this moment? Coming to Atlanta, the home of Dr. Martin Luther King, all that. So he said, yeah, let me call him and see. I put in a word for you. So he does. And A-Trap Brown gets back. He says, yeah, come on by. Come on by my grocery store. So I go to this grocery store in this little black neighborhood. And we go in the back in his little teeny office on this little teeny television. And we watch the whole thing. And I talk to him about what he thinks about Nelson Mandela, what he thinks about Martin Luther King, what he thinks about this moment. Since Nelson Mandela had been such a powerful figure, for the 27 years that he was imprisoned in Robben Island. And so that was cool. So that, that worked out. So you're always challenging yourself to find that story or find an angle into a story that, that other folks might not have.
Well, what you just articulated, I think, is what you brought to sports when you made that switch. So you go from covering, Nelson Mandela, the great anti-apartheid politician in South Africa. He overturned a system and became the country's president.
Yeah, how about that?
You cover that, and next thing you know, you're interviewing some offensive lineman about a failed trap play that cost him the game. How did just the idea that you had to juggle that type of thing? But I think what it gets to is that you always found the cultural context of where sports exist. Do you think that's what news and everything brought to?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's news. There's a couple parts to news, or maybe more than a couple parts. One of the parts is when you're energized to cover a story, it doesn't matter what it is, and you want to do it the as best you can, but you also want to find a way to try and separate that story from all the other stories that are being written on the same thing, right? You want to find a new angle into it, a new way of a new perspective.
Well, it's about being open-minded to what's going on, looking around and seeing, trying to put it into context. In terms of advocacy, obviously one of the things that I think about when I started in the late 80s as a sports writer, it was pretty evident to me that there weren't many black sports writers. I would go to events and go to games, and there just weren't many of them. And so you, being an African-American man, came into this business and you brought it a much, much needed perspective and understanding about, the vast majority of athletes that we were dealing with were black. And how did you approach it when you made the move from news to sports? Approach that? Well,
that was always, thanks for saying that. That's always been foundational to me in journalism. The reason I got into journalism was to advocate about the treatment of people of color, people of lesser means in society. That's why I got in. And so if I strayed from that, then I would feel that I wasn't being true to myself, and I wasn't making an impact in the business. And our business is critical. We're the First Amendment in the Constitution. Our business is critical. Right. And so I've always tried to apply that ideal to whatever I'm covering. Look for those stories in news. Look for those angles within covering economics. I always made a point to highlight gains or losses by people of color and women when the employment report would come out. When housing start reports would come out, those kind of routine stories, and I would kind of remind people of where everybody is in this picture. So you get to sports, and it's the same thing.
Well, those are the type of stories that just weren't being done. They just weren't being done like when I started in the business. Not many,
No.
I'll give you an example of this, Kevin. I started late 80s. I think it was like 1990. I was at the Cincinnati Post, and they had me become the college basketball writer. And it's a big sport in Cincinnati. You got University of Cincinnati, Xavier, Kentucky fans. It's big. And I love basketball. And I remember I took that beat, the Xavier University beat, and I was on a road trip early in the season. And one of the players named Michael Davenport, African-American guard, just a great guy. He and I bumped into each other on the road in the afternoon of a game, and we ended up having lunch, and we ended up talking for like 2 hours.
Wow.
And I was thinking to myself, looking back, I didn't really think about it so much at the moment, but I looked back and I said, that's the longest conversation I've ever had with a black person.
Wow.
You know, I grew up, all white grade school, all white high school, and here I am, very limited experience with dealing with, meeting and talking with African Americans. Now I'm writing about college basketball. And that conversation that I had with Michael, it really, for the first time, I think, made me think about putting myself in others' shoes, I think about a moment like that, and I think about how I then looked at stories because of that one conversation. And it's all about experience, all about open-mindedness, right?
Yeah, it is. Wow. And I never knew that about you. See, I just figured you was one of the cool dudes. That's it. I didn't realize that you went through any, and I wouldn't say that was any epiphany for you, but that you were willing to sit down and talk it out. That's incredibly important. I remember when with the Texas Rangers, when they had Ruben Sierra, Pudge Rodriguez at the same time, there was another Latin player. Well, Ruben Sierra became, I thought through the reporting, he got a bad rap. And it really wasn't his fault as much as it was those of us in the media who would not take the time to listen to his Spanish. His English was not very good. And so I think he got painted in a way that it wasn't fair to him. But the thing about sports is, when it comes to people of color, is sports is the way that most of the rest of the world, certainly in this country, sees people of color. I mean, to your point, if you come up in an all-white neighborhood, go to all-white schools, your idea, your vision of people of color are the athletes, if you like sports, are the athletes you grow up watching on TV or you see in person.
Have never crossed paths.
Exactly.
Yeah, they're just somebody else. I saw them on television.
Exactly. And so you never realize that there are other, there are greater contours to these people than just these athletes and who they and how they may behave and reflect on television or at a game that you went to. And so, I think that's important. And
well, I think it's about communication, and it's in retrospect. 30 years later, I look back and I think of myself as a young guy, and it was a moment that made me just start thinking, thinking about where whoever it is that I'm writing about is coming from. And those are the type of conversations in the moments behind the scenes that, sports writers, we're blessed to have those type of experiences, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, it's all about you. It's just so many great people you run into.
Hi, podcast listeners. I'm Carol Costello, a former CNN anchor and national correspondent. This January, I'm launching a podcast about one of the first cases I ever covered as a journalist. It's one that stuck with me all of these years, the one that buried itself under my skin and stayed put. It's a true crime series about an amazing woman named Phyllis Cottle, who defied torture and death and brought a fierce rage to the quest to find her attacker. Carol Costello Presents Blind Rage is a production of Evergreen Podcasts and signature title of the Killer Podcast Network. Listen and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Discover more great true crime and paranormal programming at killerpodcast.com.
So you're at the Dallas Morning News in the 90s.
Yeah.
And there's no bigger sports story at the time than the Dallas Cowboys. They're rolling. they're rolling to Super Bowl championships, 93, 94, 96.
Yep.
You got Jimmy and Jerry. You got all those guys. So what was it like for you to be around the Cowboys? Michael Irvin, Troy Aikman, Emmitt Smith, on and on. What was it like being around that team? Trying to find something different.
Sure.
And just try to, make an understanding of what this is all about here.
Well, having been born and reared in Washington, D.C., in a family that had season tickets to see the Washington football team play before I was even born, and for whom religion was going to games on Sunday, and whose greatest memory in sports, most thrilling moment in boyhood was watching the Washington beat Dallas 26-3 in the NFC title game to go to the Super Bowl in 72.
Hail to the Redskins.
That's right. So I hated the Cowboys. I hated the Cowboys. So now I've got to cover them and try and be objective about it. And in fact, Jim Jeffcoat, who was a lineman on those teams and is originally from Jersey, anytime Washington week came up for Dallas, I would always joke with him. As I would leave the locker room, I would tell him, Washington going to kick your ass this weekend. And he'd just laugh. We'd have a good time about it. But, it was amazing to watch. Jimmy Johnson came in 1989. Jerry Jones and Jimmy came in 1989. They had that horrific year, 1-15. Mm-hmm. The only game they won in Troy Aikman's rookie year was over Washington. So they get rolling. And the amazing thing really was to watch them piece together the talent.
So do you have a favorite Jimmy story involved that you witnessed or were part of?
I'll tell you one I was part of. The Cowboys had this rookie running back one year coming out of training camp who was pretty good. And I can't remember his name. But they were loaded at running back, and they didn't want to cut this guy loose. And so after the last preseason game, all of a sudden he showed up on the injured reserve list, which meant that they could keep him around. And so I saw him in the locker room, and I said to him, I said, when did you get hurt? And he said to me, when they told me. So,
yeah, right.
So I wrote this column basically saying that the Cowboys were learning the game, the system, just like Washington, which was famous for doing the same thing, and some other teams were famous for doing the same thing. It was kind of a tongue-in-cheek column.
Yeah, the injury report. You never can really trust the injury report, right?
No, you can't. So I come into work the day that column ran, and Dave Smith calls me into his office. I'm going, oh, what's wrong? He says, Jimmy Johnson is livid at you. He says, he said, you didn't check with him about what the running back said, and now you're making him look like a liar. And I said, well, I just quoted what the guy said. He's on the list, so I assume, he's hurt. He said, well, he's really mad. You should go talk to him. I said, okay. So I get in my car and I drive out to Valley Ranch, and it was the day of coaches availability. And so after the availability, I just went up to Jimmy and I said, I heard you're mad and you want to talk to me. He said, yeah. He says, come here. So we walk down the hallway away from where they do the little press availability thing to the front door of his office. And he turns around and he's like nose to nose with me, and he's cussing me out. So you made me look like a liar. Blah, 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 blah. And so he gets done venting. And so I said, so this means I can't cover the team anymore? And he goes, no. And I go, all right, we're good. and that was it. But, that was one of the things that Galloway always taught me. He said, if you're going to criticize someone, and like I said, I looked at this as a tongue-in-cheek column, right?
Right.
You gotta be available. You got to make them, and so that's what I did.
Yeah, face the music.
Yeah,
right?
just the music. Yeah. And in fact, I remember show up. That's exactly right. And I remember going out there that day and waiting for the I was in the locker room waiting for the coach's availability, and Michael Irvin came over, and he was like, man, that was some funny shit you wrote about it. He said, that was hilarious, man. He was rolling. Some other people said the same thing, but Jimmy didn't find it funny at all.
No, not at all.
Not at all. Not at all.
Yeah, tell me, I mean, so you traveled the world. You bring this perspective and this knowledge and the background, and then you end up traveling the world, the Olympics, Wimbledon, Tour de France, British Open. That is an experience, too. What was it like to go around the world and write about sports?
Not necessarily seeing the rest of the world, but just seeing how the rest of the world kind of celebrates sports. I'm trying to remember.
Do you have a moment that stands out?
Oh, yeah. When the Sydney games, in fact, I'm drinking out of a Sydney mug right here. When the Sydney games happened, one of the things that I asked if I could do before I switched over to the sports department was cover the Olympics. I said, Dave, can I cover the Olympics? He said, absolutely. I said, good, we got a deal. So when I saw the Sydney games on the calendar, I was like, I got to go. And the reason I wanted to go was because I wanted to meet Peter Norman. Peter Norman.
Great athlete.
He's the
silver
third
medalist
person, the silver medalist in the 200. That's right, the third person with Carlos and Smith. And so I get to Sydney, and before I got there, I was trying to find out where he was. I located him. I got the message to him, and we met one day at the track facility, and I interviewed him that afternoon, and that was incredible. I remember
that's a big moment in sports and politics and culture.
All came together.
I mean, when they protested on the stand, there's Peter Norman, a white Australian, standing there with them.
Exactly, and he suffered retribution for joining their protests by supporting their protests when he got back to Australia. So he was shunned for quite some time. Going to the rest of the world, I mean, that's what always fascinated me. It wasn't so much the sports there, but it was like, what was going on. I also remember in Sydney, the woman who's I think she was a 400, 800 runner for Australia, and she was
Kathy Freeman.
Kathy Freeman, yes.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite moments that I ever experienced as a sports writer.
You were there, right?
I was sitting right there on the track.
So that night I decided, I said, you know what? I'm not going to go to the track, but I want to go to a neighborhood. I want to go to a neighborhood where her people would be,
right,
and watch it there. And so that's what I did. And I found this beer hall, yes, for beer, this beer hall in Sydney, and watched it there. And to see these folks,
not hard to find in Sydney.
No, not at all. Thank goodness for the beer over there, man. That's a great country for beer. And if you remember, when we got to Sydney, there was a big protest going on in downtown Sydney around Aboriginal rights, and people had camped out and everything. And
but I visited one of those camps the day before Kathy ran.
There you go.
That's kind of how I set up the race. I went and talked to people and tried to put it in that context. And I remember like, again, this wasn't a woman running one time around a track. This was something else going on.
Exactly.
Something bigger was going on.
And that was the amazing thing. You had, what a juxtaposition. You had these camps where people are fighting, people like her are fighting for their rights. And at the same time, she's on billboards, right, where the country is celebrating her.
Right.
So to your point, that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be with those people that night and feel their sense of pride in having one of their own, a woman who grew up suffering the slings and arrows of a society that treated indigenous people horribly.
Well, when she won her race, I don't know if you remember, but she walked the track with the flag, and then she sat and took her Remember, she took her spikes off. She sat down.
Right.
Literally, she was 20 feet from me.
That's incredible.
And I just think of that right now, and I'm getting chills.
Yeah.
Because it was a moment that it was top 5 moments I've ever experienced. And people always want to know about this sporting event or that sporting event.
That's
and I'm
right.
like, no, it was this one race in Australia. And that's the kind of thing that I think sports writers who've had long careers think about. And even in Sydney, like I think about, it doesn't have to be a great, big political moment.
No.
I mean, there was a time I went to cover table tennis, which I call ping pong, right?
Exactly.
So,
right.
And I go there, and there was a guy, somebody from Japan, I believe, who was like the Michael Jordan of ping pong. And there was like 30 reporters running around with this guy. And he was so famous, he had to wear a disguise in public. And it just, again, opened my eyes to this idea that, what we see in America or what we value or there's things around the world that we just don't know. And sports brings that to life, especially at the Olympics.
Yeah, the Olympics. I mean, it's a smorgasbord of human stories.
I think it's about talking to people on an individual level and bringing them to how they fit into the bigger aspect of what they're involved in. And sometimes it's the conversations you remember, right? I think you once mentioned that we dehumanize it, but the individuals matter. I mean, and I think look what's going on with the social context of sports now with Colin Kaepernick, in 2016. But he was just He didn't start sports protests. It's been going on for 100 years. It's always been part of the society we live in. There's no separation. And I think that's what you bring to the coverage of the events and the movements and the individuals. I mean, you put it in such great cultural context that I always feel like I learn something when I read a Kevin Blackistone column.
I appreciate that. It's it's a history that's it hasn't fully been told. That's why I teach a course in Maryland, and it's called Sports Protest and Media, where I try and do a few things. Number one, I try and show students that sports and politics have been bedfellows since sports were born. The marathon race was born out of a run made by a soldier to alert Athens as to what was about to happen, right? So that's it. That was the political reason for the marathon, and then I try and make them understand that not only have they been bedfellows forever, but sport is a natural platform for protests for a number of different reasons that scholars have made very clear as they've studied it. And then the other thing I like them to know is that, there have been many instances along the way where people have used sports to protest. And sometimes it's been people in sports, and sometimes it's been people outside of sports who have used sports to protest. Whether it's...
Well, think about like Rose Robinson, right? Rose Robinson was a black high jumper.
Sure.
1959, I believe.
Yep.
She protested against the American foreign policy at the Pan Am Games.
Yep.
Yep. And she refused to stand for the national anthem. She was Kaepernick of her time.
Yeah.
In 1959, but I don't think people, we don't think past last week, right?
No, exactly. And her story, really didn't get covered until the past few years. So, people need to understand that so that we don't. It's kind of like my mother used to say, there's little that's new today, right? When you start looking back in history, and that's absolutely true. And when you have protests in sports, it has a great impact because sports are transcendent. And even people who don't pay attention to sports will pay attention to sports when something happens in sports that is transcendent.
Right. So you've done this for 40 years. And you're still doing it at a high level. I'm not making you retire, but what's next? What do you want to do next in your career? I mean, you've done a little bit of everything. You've covered everything. You're at the Washington Post. You're on ESPN. You've worked various places. You've done NPR, PBS, documentaries. You teach.
And so, I've been working on a film project the last 5 years now. and slowly making progress towards the end. And I love documentary film. So
it's about Native American mascots, right?
It's about Native American mascot. I've been working on it since I started it in 2014 with a friend of mine, and it's called Imagining the Indian. Racism started with what happened to indigenous people. That is the seed on this continent, and so in order to eradicate racism, we have to understand what happened to these people and how we were, and in this particular instance, how sport and commercialism was an integral part in that, played an incredible role in that. And so it was very interesting just to watch how the protests in the wake of George Floyd's murder caught up to this idea. Right? Mm-hmm. It swept Confederate imagery and Confederate monuments out of our
the teams changing their names, yeah,
right. And somehow teams changing their names. Yeah. The Washington football team, the Cleveland baseball team, Atlanta, you're up next. Chicago, you're up next. Golden State, you're up next.
Right.
So it's really been fascinating to see this thing come around. So yeah, that's what I want to do. I want to finish that, and
I think this moment all speaks to the work that you've done in your career, you and other great journalists. And I think, if anything, it's made us realize, sports writing is not the toy department.
Oh, no, not at all.
I mean, it's fun and games, and there's been a lot of great things. Times and jokes and laughs, but sports exist sports exist in the world.
Absolutely,
it's not just a game.
No,
and you shed a light on that for years and years, and I think our business is better off for it. And I know personally, I'm better off for having met you. My only regret is that we didn't talk more often during my career. We would chit chat at an event, and I think oh man, that guy, I should get to know him better. So it's very fortunate to have you on this episode.
Thanks, Todd. Appreciate it.
You're the only person I know who covered Nelson Mandela and saw Mike Tyson bite a chunk of ear off of Holyfield's head. That's quite a career.
That's pretty good. Pretty amazing stories right there. Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Kevin. I really appreciate you joining us, and peace.
Thanks for the invite.
Thanks for listening to Pressbox Access. You can find us here with a new episode every other Wednesday. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe and follow us on Apple Podcasts or on your favorite podcast app. We'd love for you to review us. 5 stars would be nice. Follow us on social media. Drop us an email at pressboxaccess@gmail.com. And be sure to spread the word. Everyone is welcomed here. This has been a production of Evergreen Podcasts. A special thank you to executive producers Michael D'Aloia and Gerardo Orlando, producer Sarah Wilgrube, and our audio engineer Dave Douglas. I'm your host, Todd Jones. It's closing time. Rock on.
Hear Her Sports is a podcast for everyone who loves stories by and about women striving to improve and make a difference in their lives. I am your host, Elizabeth Emery, a former professional cyclist. In every episode, I introduce a female athlete or woman in the business of sport through a thoughtful conversation about who they are and the terrific work they're doing. My guests and I explore the glorious and frustrating issues in sports, history, equity, training, nutrition, and so much more. Join us for inspiration, for community, and for love of being a strong, athletic woman.